All right. So what we have today is the American Revolution and kind of the idea of world history. There is a ton of information on the American Revolution. There's honestly, and in world history, a lot of places split the concept of world history, especially when you get college, up into either segments that are entire spring or fall classes. Some people do world history in a 2 years time versus doing world geography and then doing world history. There's so much more again that we could get into with American Revolution and the format and why and all that of the American Revolution. But this video that I'm about to show you is only 9 minutes long. It's going to go by pretty fast. I'll end up posting it on there so then that way you can kind of get a good idea if you want to go back and watch it. But it tells a good, quick version of how we got into the American Revolution, some key points during and along the way, and what got us to the point of where we went from Britain exploring, Columbian Exchange, the colonies, war, the Americas, expansion, continue, the United States. All right. And that's a lot of stuff, but then you kind of got to condense and simplify it right here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you this video. And again, dude talks fast. But as you go through and as we go through and as we watch what is there, there's 6 key points that are over there. I'm going to read them to you so that way you home got it. Taxes in America, Boston Massacre, origins of United States government, the American Revolution, Declaration of Independence / Constitution, and then Peace Treaty of Paris. You're going to pick 2 of these here in a little bit. So kind of pay attention to some of that stuff as we go through the film. When the 9-minute part is over, you're going to talk and explain kind of the reasons of why the American Revolution happened in your opinion. Okay. And there's some big key factors of what it is. So kind of recite back to me in your own opinion, what are some of the major reasons of why that did happen? All right. So I'm going to show you this video right here.
A huge thank you to everyone who's
make sure. Right there and right there. The lag. And here we go.
Since the Europeans had discovered the Americas in the 1490s, they had been exploring, conquering, and colonizing the newfound continent for the next few centuries. By the 18th century, North America had been colonized by Britain, France, and Spain. In 1754, a war began between France and Britain over disputed territories in North America. It spilled over into a colonial war across the world and ultimately led to British forces defeating the French. Who had been helped by several Native American tribes. Great Britain had won the war but was left heavily in debt. At this time, many generations had been living in America. This was their home. Britain decided to tax the American colonists for the first time. They refused to pay tax as they didn't have representation in the British Parliament by their rights as English. Colonists refused representation too in Britain, as being on the opposite side of the Atlantic made it a little impractical. American colonists began to boycott British goods and angry mobs against the British grew. The British Parliament repeated the Stamp Act, but maintained it should govern over its colonies in America. The British decided to increase taxes to be paid on customs duty for imported British goods such as tea, paper, paints, lead, and glass, which the Americans were reliant on. This angered more and more colonists. 4,000 British troops were sent to Massachusetts to try and threaten the people of Boston. They simply organized more boycotts, but it was difficult because the highly taxed goods were so widely used. Tensions ran high in March 1770 as 5 colonists were killed by British soldiers during a heated incident. Word of the Boston Massacre was spread around the 13 British colonies and outrage ensued. In 1773, Britain tried to import and sell untaxed tea to the East India Company. Because Britain was trying to monopolize the tea, the Americans held the ships in Boston and didn't allow them to unload. On December 6th, a group known as the Sons of Liberty, disguised as Native Americans, boarded the ships and dumped the tea into the sea in what became known as the Boston Tea Party. In 1774, Britain punished Massachusetts with a series of acts to control the colony and place its own royal governor to take charge. But the people set up their own provincial congress. Britain was in control of Boston, but the Americans had control of the countryside as they began organizing and training militias. American patriot leaders from 12 of the 13 colonies came together and convened the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia. They petitioned the king, wanting rid of the taxes and the royal governors, claiming that British parliaments had no place in internal American affairs, but they were happy to agree to the trade regulations. The British response, however, was more and more regulations, restrictions, and an increased army presence. In February 1775, Massachusetts was declared to be in a state of rebellion by the British Parliament. By April, the British commander, Lieutenant General Thomas Gage, was ordered to disarm the rebels and arrest their leaders. Paul Revere and other writers rode through the night ahead of the British forces to warn the leaders in Lexington and Concord. By the time the British reached Lexington, militia were waiting for them. The first shots were fired and the militiamen fell back to Concord. The British followed them to be met by 500 militiamen. The overwhelmed British forces fell back in retreat and the war had begun. The militia chased them back to Boston and besieged the city. The Second Continental Congress of all three colonies came together to organize the war effort. The militias were to be reorganized into the Continental Army, with Congressman George Washington appointed as their general. The 13 colonies organized revolutionary governments and began to expel the royal governors, taking control for themselves. British reinforcements led by General William Howe landed across from Boston and captured the Charlestown Peninsula in the Battle of Bunker Hill, but at a high cost of life. But they were unable to break the siege. The King of England issued a proclamation of rebellion urging the British forces to quell the Patriots. They began recruiting from Britain and Ireland and even hired Hessian mercenaries from the Holy Roman Empire. General Washington arrived at the siege of Boston the following month to take charge. Despite a shortage of munitions and gunpowder, the siege lasted through the autumn and winter, the British failing to press any advantage. The Continental Army also pressed into British-controlled Quebec to try and get the French-speaking Canadians on their side, but the British forces ultimately pushed them back. By March 1776, General Washington had gathered cannons and placed them on the hills overlooking Boston. The British chose to evacuate and head for Halifax in Nova Scotia. Knowing it would make a great naval base for the British, General Washington moved his forces down to New York City to defend it. General Howe's British forces landed close by on Staten Island in June. Meanwhile, the Congress were formally establishing a document explaining their position. Congressman Thomas Jefferson first drafted what became the Declaration of Independence, and it was ratified on the 4th of July, 1776. It declared that the 13 colonies were to be recognized as no longer part of the British Empire. They were to become known as a new nation, the United States of America. By August, General Howe's forces were ready to attack. Washington divided his troops between Manhattan and Long Island, but the British forces managed to flank them. The American forces were ultimately driven out of New York in defeat. The British forces saw American prisoners as traitors and not prisoners of war, and thus treated them as such. They kept them in prison ships in New York, and more Americans died of neglect and disease in these ships than in the rest of the war. Washington's forces escaped through New Jersey, across the Delaware River to Pennsylvania. Howe chose not to follow them, even though American forces were dwindling into the winter. Congress fled Philadelphia in despair with the British forces moving closer. Howe spread his forces thin throughout New Jersey, and General Washington decided to attack before the end of the year. He stealthily crossed the River Delaware at night, at Christmas, and surprised 1,000 Hessian mercenaries at Trenton. After a few more American victories, General Howe conceded most of New Jersey to General Washington, despite his greater numbers. Washington took it easy for the rest of the winter, while militia continued to attack small British forces. Throughout 1777, a British force under General Burgoyne pushed down from Quebec to try to cut off New England from the other colonies. It was a tough campaign, but was ultimately stopped at Saratoga, New York, by American forces under Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold. Burgoyne hoped for help from Howe, but he'd sailed his forces south to take Philadelphia. Burgoyne surrendered. Howe outmaneuvered Washington and captured Philadelphia. Washington spent that winter in Valley Forge, where his force lost many men through cold and disease. Howe had sent his resignation and chose not to attack. During 1777 also, Congress officially adopted their new flag. To stop the British from growing more powerful, France officially declared their allegiance with the Americans and their struggle for independence in 1778. The British offered that the colonies could go back to the way they were, pre-tax, pre-war allegiance to the crown. They were rejected. On the sea, as usual, Britain had the superior fleet, while the Americans relied on privateering to grow their non-existent fleet. Sir Henry Clinton took over from Howe and moved his forces back up to New York as the French Navy approached. The British had armed many Native American tribes and loyalists to fight against the colonists, so George Washington ordered the Sullivan expedition to burn down Iroquois and loyalist crops and villages. In 1779, Spain officially entered the war on the side of the Americans. French and Spanish threats elsewhere in the world, such as the West Indies, were forcing the British to remove soldiers from North America. The war in the North ultimately slowed to a stalemate. The British then looked south. Clinton left New York to hopefully get a stronger foothold in the South and more support from loyalists. The winter of 1779 was even worse for the Northern Continental armies. The American armies were falling apart as conditions were terrible and money was worthless. Mutinies broke out in 1780, but militias were able to hold back any British troops trying to press an advantage. By May 1780, Clinton had captured Charleston, South Carolina, and most of the Southern Continental Army along with it. He returned to New York, leaving Lord Cornwallis in charge of the Southern British Army. Up north, the French landed some troops in Rhode Island, but the British Navy stopped any further French landing. Benedict Arnold had been growing disenchanted by the war and defected to the British. Horatio Gates took charge of the remaining American forces in the south, but was defeated at the Battle of Camden, allowing Georgia and South Carolina to fall back under British control. In 1781, Cornwallis continued to push through North Carolina, but his forces were worn down by battles with newly appointed General Nathaniel Greene. Cornwallis retreated his forces to Wilmington, North Carolina, leaving Georgia and South Carolina. By the end of September 1781, the British only controlled Savannah and Charleston in the south. Cornwallis continued his force north into Virginia, where he ultimately set up a base in Yorktown on a peninsula. The French fleet moved in and fought off the British ships there, cutting off Cornwallis by sea. The combined American and French forces under General Washington and the Comte de Rochambeau moved in and surrounded Cornwallis, who ultimately surrendered his army on October 9th, 1781. British reinforcements were sent out from New York that same day, but it was too late. News reached Britain the following month, and the king wanted to continue the war. Fighting against France, Spain, and the Dutch Republic was still happening around the world. The Tory Prime Minister Lord North resigned, and power went to the Liberal Whig Party, who recognized American independence and ended the war. Peace Treaty of Paris was agreed in 1783, and Britain signed over the lands to the United States of America. This included Native American land west of the Appalachian Mountains, unknowns to the Native Americans themselves. There would be long and fierce fighting to come over this land. France practically bankrupted itself paying for the war, leading to its own revolution in 1789. The United States would organize itself in the coming decades. They drafted their constitution in 1787 and ratified it in 1788. In 1789, George Washington was unanimously elected the first president of the United States of America. The next year, he chose an area along the Potomac River, roughly halfway down the 13 colonies, to be the new nation's capital, Washington, D.C. The United States of America would grow in many ways to become one of, if not the most powerful country in the world, but it had a long and bumpy road ahead of it, both literally and metaphorically. Thanks very much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed it.
Let me turn back on the lights. I found a really good one, and there's we couldn't use it because there was like a couple parts in there, of course, that said one or two words that you have to edit wise and yada yada yada. But anyway, there's some pretty good ones that are out there on the American Revolution, and get a little bit more in depth, a little slower on some other parts of it. But in general, what led to the cause of the American Revolution, the Americas forming, fighting back against Britain? What was the overall idea and why? Okay, what does that mean? Taxation without representation.
Like you tax somebody, but you're not really there to like deal.
Okay, so like you get taxed if you collect a paycheck for working at a restaurant. Your parents get taxed every job they do, every time they get something. Are they represented, and how are they represented? Okay, they can vote, and in essence, they also vote someone in at a local, at a state, at a national level to represent their thought. They get to choose someone who they think aligns with their values to be able to represent them. Okay, how did the United States people, which at that time was Britain, why were they and how were they not being represented? Yes, sir. Okay, they did not. They did not have a voice in Parliament. Kind of using this example with some of the other classes that were in here. Let's say that this right here is Britain. All right. And with this in Britain, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 slices of pizza. All right. If this guy right here says, hey, I want hamburger, but all of these other dudes say, I want pepperoni, what kind of pizza should they order? Pepperoni. All right. But however, they were like, no, we're going to order hamburger for everybody. That's how it was to America. All right. They didn't feel like they were actually getting represented into the part of, that might be even more weird if I freeze myself on there. So it messed them over to the point of they thought, well, we're British citizens. We moved here and took a chance to establish more British land before the Spanish took over, before the French took over. There's all of these Native American people that are here that we're having to deal with. We're the ones risking a lot of it. Why are we not being at least represented. It wasn't very much to ask. But the big thing was they were like this pile of crust that was left over here. Okay. It was across the way, across the sea. So there was a huge disconnect between the actual pizza and the remnants of what was left of the pizza. Does that make sense? Okay. All they wanted was to be the number 3 dude. All right. They just wanted to have a little say in it, because in the end, the United States, or what would become the United States, the 13 colonies passed through with British rule, they were making Britain a ton of money, because that was where all the exports were coming out. That's where all the connection to essentially what was the Silk Road of the East gave them the opportunity to have all of these new goods. So the US was extremely valuable. It also had a new chance to be able to open up all these doors of exploration, newfound stuff to the West, and continuation on. All right. But then the British said, I tell you what, I'm tired of you guys saying that you're not getting represented. I'm going to tax you. Well, they kept saying it, and they kept saying, we need representation, we need representation. And then they tax them more and more and more and more to essentially shut them up from saying, we need representation. All right. So then it leads to some of these events that are over here. All right. So the idea of taxes in America, the idea of the Boston Massacre, even though it necessarily wasn't a massacre, it plays out kind of like propaganda as a massacre to stimulate the masses, to be able to get the militia to go back and fight against, get into the old school movie, The Patriot, back in Mel Gibson's old days. I'll tell you a story here in a little while after I turn off the Zoom on there. Origins of the U.S. government, how we started. Again, the overall part of the American Revolution. What's so vital about the idea of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights and whatnot, is that our forefathers all the way back in 1776, 1787 and forward, like that hasn't been amended very many times. You know what I mean? They put enough thought, enough understanding of what basic men and women needed in a country versus what they were getting. And it's held its ground for all those years, with very few amendments to it, very few additions to it. You look at other countries who have either completely scrapped their overall Constitution, Bill of Rights and whatnot, countries that have fallen, countries that have had to start all over again, countries that have to make a ton of amendments. And these were some extremely intelligent, extremely thought-provoking type people to be able to establish the United States and how they established it during that time. And then, of course, the Peace Treaty of Paris. America and what it would be survived so many different obstacles. It survived the British. It survived creating allies, and then France and Spain, who was like, well, if I align with the U.S. rebels on this one, if they win, Britain's going to be done, and then we can just defeat the rebels and we can take their land. We can be the big entrepreneurs of the West. For us to actually make it to the United States of America is extremely impressive. Winter was a big deal. All right. The advantages of home court with the United States, having the advantage of winter, George Washington deciding, again, a lot of military leaders are luck rather than strategery. And it worked out. And then in turn, you see the presence of former military greats being the presidents of the United States, because they're well-renowned heroes to the world that's there. All right. Again, we could talk about American Revolution for a long time, but this is all we got time for on it. What I want you to do now is get out a sheet of paper. And on your sheet of paper, there's the 6 themes that we just read to you, and they're listed on the board over there. I'll take it over here. I know you got to read it backwards, but there it is. There we go. Okay. And what I want you to do is those 6 themes, I want you to select 2 of those 6, okay, of your choice. On the front page of your paper, write down a half-page summary about one of those 6. Flip it over. On the back page, half a page summary about the second one of those 6s. I would use my MyHRW to give me a good guidance point of a summary, because if you go on the internet, I mean, like I said, all these can be really, really expanded into really big, lengthy things. The MyHRW is going to give you a pretty shorter version of what it is, so you can write you a summary. Once you get finished with that, there is a 4 to 5 question quiz on chapter 22, section 4 on Canvas. Make sure you complete chapter 22, section 4 multiple choice quiz. When you come in tomorrow, you'll turn in your written assignment to the box. You'll be good to go. Okay. Any questions? Yes, sir. I have some up here I can give you off of my notebook pad that's there. All right. Okay. All right.